This is Groundeffected. My name is Brent, and welcome to nearly knocking a model off my table again. In this video, I'm going to show you how I paint skin tones. Yes, again. But this time, I'm not going to cut out all the bits and pieces in between. I'm going to show you the entire process of layering the skin tones from start to finish, including how I water down and thin my paints through the airbrush, and I'm going to show you on this model. This was sculpted by Saber, who you can find a link to his Instagram in the description below. This is another Djinn from Djinn Wars, and I'm proud to be saying that I've been painting their models for the last few months, and it's been quite an experience. I have previously done an entire painting video on painting this Djinn and Khufu. If you look further on my channel, you will find that video somewhere. By the way, just click like right now, you might as well, because I can promise by the end of the video, I will have earned that like from you, one way or another. And while you're down there, you might as well click subscribe. And if the video didn't live up to your expectations, it's pretty easy, I'll give you some instructions for that in the last few seconds of this video. So, let's have a little chat about how do I thin the paint. This has been asked quite a few times in a lot of my videos. And one of the first things that I do is I like to paint my base layer of skin tones down. And if you've watched any of my videos about painting skin tone, you will notice that I paint quite a reddish kind of flesh tone. That will be my base tones for the skins. After that, I like to layer up in layers, and I have a pretty fleshed out process of how I do this. Essentially, the first coat is going to go down super solid, whatever goes through the airbrush, as long as it's a solid coat. The next layer is going to go down in a little bit of a thinner coat, and the reason for this is transparency of the paint. You can see here how thin the paints are. They're not the most thinnest, but it is quite a thin consistency, and as you can see, this doesn't cover too much of the previous layer below it. So using this is going to be able to enable me to build up on the tones bit by bit. This means I can layer over an area once and get one level of highlights, and layer over it again to get another level of highlights. I can essentially do this up to 3 or 4 layers on top of each other just by thinning the paints. This essentially breaks down one color and gives me 3 or 4 colors from that color. And yes, they're not really technically called colors. At that point it would be a hue, but to make it easier to understand, I use the word color so that you can understand that all I'm doing is breaking up one color into multiple hues of color. And this enables me to create highlights and build up shadows and all that kind of stuff with just one color at a time. As you can see, I use the first layers are going to start being my highlight layers, so I'm going to use them as if they were lights themselves. Wherever the light would hit the model is where I'm going to start layering down these colors, and I'm going to work my way up through these colors as I go along, and I'm slowly going to layer them over the top of each other. By thinning them down, what I'm enabling myself is to be able to mix these colors on the piece as opposed to mixing them in a palette and then spraying them on. This gives me more control over how much I want in an area. I can also increase the highlights, or I can work on the shadows and put a little bit more darker in the shadows. Using thin paints is one of the best things you can do. This is going to increase your level of skills by a million gazillion %. That is a scientific fact, and this is why I want to explain to you how I thin my paints. Here you can see I'm going in with a little bit of the reddish shadows into the darker areas of the piece, and I'm using quite a thin paint again. This again is so that it can build up. I don't know how many times I can tell you, but just make sure your paints are really thin. This way, if it takes you 10 layers to get to full saturation, great, but at least you had control, full control, the whole way up until you got to full saturation. On my highlights here, you can see it's almost a 50-50 mixture of paint versus water. In my case, I'm using water. A lot of the times it is beneficial to use airbrush medium depending on the paints that you use, but I find the Vallejo skin set and most of the colors that I use, to be fair, don't necessarily break up too much with water. If your paints are starting to break up and there's like little bits in it, then usually that is because there is not enough medium to spread the pigment through. So if this is happening, you probably need to get yourself something like an airbrush medium or a paint thinner for acrylic paints. And as you can see how thin these paints are, they run like very milky, watery kind of substance, and this is, again, I can't stress it enough, to help with the transparency of the paint. This is so that I can layer and layer and layer. I build up my skin tones from a layer over on top of a layer on top of a layer, and this is the easiest way to keep control, full control over the paint as you're painting it. Once the highlights are all done and I'm satisfied with the highlights being in the right places, I'm going to need to start working on some of the shadow areas, as well as bring a little bit more life back into the skin. Using skin tones like this, they do tend to desaturate after a while, especially if you're using a lot of the light colors, mainly because a white skin tone is not just a pasty white skin tone all the way through. It's got a lot of colors in it. It even has blues and greens and things like that. But in my case, I paint in a very comic style way, so for me to go too realistic with it would start to look awkward with my own style. At least I wouldn't feel comfortable painting in that style anyway. So in order to add some more of that blood underneath the surface of the skin, I'm going to use my favorite trick, which is Grimoire Purple. And this is something that a lot of people ask me, how thin do I make Grimoire Purple? Well, Grimoire Purple needs to be so thin you can barely see it on your skin. You can barely see it if you painted it on a piece of paper. It is super thin. It's basically just water with a little bit of paint. And again, I only use water for this. If you were going to go to the point of paint breaking up, this was going to be the point that paint would break up, because I use probably 90% water to maybe 10% of Grimoire Purple, if that. And the paint for me doesn't break up. I find that it works perfectly well. It thins down extremely great and it dries really nicely. One thing to note is that it'll go down and it not look like it's doing anything. Allow it to dry and see what that looks like after at least 10-15 minutes, because it does dry a little bit darker. Thank you for watching another Groundeffected video, and of course, we are now at the end where I need to do a couple of things, like announcements for Artist of the Month on the Patreon. However, I'm not going to do that in this video just because I have a lot going on right now. I will definitely get to that in the next video or two, so please don't hate me, Patreons. It is not my fault. There is a lot going on right now, but I will get around to that soon. Also, there is the competition that I ran on Instagram, ended yesterday, and I will also have to announce the winners for that as well. I think I'm going to announce that on Instagram though, so keep your eyes out for that. I will give more information in the next few days or so. Thank you for your great cooperation in this matter. And since we're thanking and doing things like that, I'd also like to thank the new patrons that we got this week. It is because of the patrons that I'm able to keep these lights burning the corneas of my eyeballs, and without the lights, there is no videos. And so to those people, I must say thank you, especially the 3 new ones: Douglas Spencer, William Douglas Pridgeon, Verid Rose. Thank you, my dudes, so much for helping to blind the corneas of my eyeballs and helping to facilitate the complete takeover of YouTube by Groundeffected. Now that the housekeeping is all done and I haven't knocked over a model in a video, which is an excellent thing, and it's probably a good time for me to tell you, if you didn't like anything you saw in the video, it's a pretty easy process. Thereafter, all you need to do is just click the dislike button and then kindly f off. This was one of the most precarious model situations I've been in. That was so close so many times.